My name is Erinma, and I'll be chairing this session and questioning Nazir.
Absolutely. Can I firstly thank you very much for staying to the bitter end. I was watching about several dozen of you leaving and making them feel really guilty. But I'm absolutely delighted that so many of you have stayed to the end of this conference. And I firstly want to thank Stronger Things and everybody else for putting putting this together and giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. When I was talking to colleagues about what I would want to talk about, I wanted to understand, or wanted perhaps you to appreciate the difference between what the public want, and I'm sure you know this, and what the public want and what the institutions provide. As you will know, I spent 24 years in prosecuting. Half of that time I was Chief Prosecutor here in London and then in the northwest of England. And then I moved into, I was Chief Exec of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners. So I spent a lot of that time in justice and working in trying to understand the concerns that the communities had. I think that was a problem for my own institution, or that institution, was that they made a mistake. The mistake was to think that independence was the same as detachment. And they did not want to talk to the public. In fact, I remember talking to some of my colleagues about 20 years ago saying, no, we shouldn't go and talk to them. They might change our minds. I think there was and again, I'm a lawyer myself, but I don't have a lot of time for lawyers. No disrespect to any lawyers in the room. Because we have our own language. We love our ultra vires and our res ipsa loquitur and a bit of Latin here and a bit of Latin there in order to distance ourselves from the people for whom we are providing a service. And I think that's a mistake. And when I first started engaging with the public was around about 20 years ago when I was here in London. We had the first knife crime epidemic that I was aware of in my lifetime. And I said to my teams, because at that time I was the first Muslim chief prosecutor in the country, and I said to my teams, we need to go out and talk to the people most impacted by these behaviors. And their response was, invite them to our offices. And of course, guess what? Nobody came. And I said, no, we will go out. And again, one of the things I learned the hard way, I guess, is you have to lead by example. And so I remember going to above a bookmaker's in Harlesden in North London, talking to all these young men wearing bandanas across their faces, as if I could recognize them. And even if I could, I wouldn't know who they were. And then they talked to me about the impact of the environment and the impact of poverty and education and poor policing in why they felt the need to carry knives. There was no excuses. They were talking factually about the environment they were in. And I went back to my office and said, oh my God, I've learned so much. And the first response from my business manager was, you didn't carry out a risk assessment. And I said, well, I'm back, aren't I? And I don't know what they felt that, what was going to happen to me. But I then went with that information to the Home Office, and it was a time when the Home Office listened. And I said to them, look, you need to respond to what you've just heard, what I've just heard. And they thankfully allowed me then to do a bit more of this. And they created then what was the very first serious violent crime strategy, which the government had never done, any government had ever done at that time. And strangely, about a couple of years ago, I saw the same strategy being pulled out of a filing cabinet in the Home Office 20 years later. But nonetheless, to their credit, they did it, they responded, and there was my first lesson that I'm not an expert, the communities are the experts. The public are the experts. The people who are impacted by behaviors are the experts. And we are just the facilitators. And we are the people who should act upon what we've heard. And that's the second lesson. Second lesson I picked up was leadership is about listening. Although what I'm doing right now is talking, invariably what leaders do is they go into a room and I'm going to tell you stuff. When in fact they should be going into a room, I want to listen to what you're going to tell me. And that was a massive difference in the way I began to operate myself personally. And so again, once I dealt with knife crime, once I'd responded to knife crime, I then literally opened the door. And I said, right, who else? Which NGOs, which charities, which groups have got issues where we as a state have not addressed them? So NGO after NGO were coming in and saying, Nazir, what about antisocial behavior? I said, fine, let's work on that. And so we developed the first ever national strategy for tackling antisocial behavior. What about sport crime that happen in sporting environments? So I organized the very first conference on sports crime. And then a large group of women came to me and said, Nazir, honor-based abuse and forced marriage, nobody's talking about that. We're dealing with victims, nobody's talking about that. And what they meant is that nobody in the state, or the authorities, institutions were talking about that. So I organized a conference not far from here in Westminster. I organized it specifically in Westminster because I spoke to some parliamentarians and said, you need to come to this conference. They said, oh no, we're too busy. And so I organized it across the road from Parliament. And I said, don't come for the whole day, just come when you want to. And to their credit, many of them just walked in 20 minutes, half an hour, listened to a survivor, went away massively informed. At that time, I knew that was the first conference this country had had on forced marriage and honor-based abuse. I subsequently learned it was the world's first conference on forced marriage and honor-based abuse. And again, that was coming from the people who are impacted by it, telling me that something needs to be done, and me allowing my office, or enabling my office, to facilitate a conversation. But it wasn't enough to have that conversation. What next? And these groups said to me, Nazir, two things. No man is talking about this subject, and nobody with the position of access to power is talking about this subject. Please talk about it. And so I said, inform me, educate me. And they gave me story upon story of failure upon failure, and I realized something needed to happen, and so I did. One of the other things that one has to do is you find time for this. At that time, I was responsible for 150,000 prosecutions a year, everything from road traffic to homicide. But it was important there were great people doing all those work. It was important for me to focus on those areas that we were not doing really well. That's again what leaders should do, is identify the gaps and plug the gaps. And so I went out, I looked at the work we were doing. We were dealing with these cases, but we weren't recognizing it. So we weren't flagging them as these types of cases. And we had no data. You will appreciate, and more so now than ever before, unless you have data, you have nothing. And so I went and talked to the Metropolitan Police, and I said to them, you owe me some favors. Can you send some data analysts to go through the homicides last year and try and identify how many of them were honor-based related? And to their credit, they did, and they came back and said, Nazir, in 2004, 12 women were killed in the name of honor in this country. I said, right, well, that's terrible news, but that's good news. I can now go to the government and to institutions and say, that's the problem. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And I went and I set up, again, the Home Office in a listening mode, set up a group of educationalists and welfare, every government department was represented, and they looked at the data, we looked at the casework, and also the other thing I learned is that stories tell anything better than data could ever do. And so I started sharing some of those cases, and why they had failed, and why people had not been listened to, and why we had messed up massively. And I said to them, is that going to be you, Department of Education? Is that going to be you, Department of Welfare? And their ears pricked up, I need to do something about it. And they did. To their credit, they all introduced national guidelines, and it went further. When we had legislation is necessary, so we have the forced marriage protection legislation. Again, people don't appreciate the battle we had to bring that law in, because it wasn't a government bill. And so we had to persuade the Attorney General and the Prime Minister to back it. And sometimes it's not about the emotional case, the legal case, the moral case. It was the business case that I presented there. I said to them, back then, an investigation and prosecution costs £1 million a year. It's now 1.5 million, by the way, for every homicide. And I said, if we can, and they said, it'll bring in this new legislation would cost us £2 million a year. I said, if I save one life, that'll pay for your legislation. And to the credit of the Prime Minister at that time, he said, right, fine, we'll back it, and they backed it. And since that time, since 2008, 3,500 protection orders have been issued. 3,500 lives have been saved. Government owe me big time, financially. But the point is, sometimes you have to use whatever tools at your disposal. And in this case, it was a business case that we put in place. And then there was a terrible case, again, a London case called Banaz Mahmood. If you've seen the ITV film Honor, it's based on that. It was a case where there were so many failings that led to this young girl being murdered that we had to change everything. And we did. not only did we introduce guidelines across every bit of justice, I literally, you know, the young ladies and girls and boys who are walking around, boys and girls, who I'm showing my age now, who are walking around with T-shirts about today's event. And on the back of the T-shirt, you have all the venues that you would go to, and a rock band would have that. My T-shirt from that year would be the Royal College of Medicine, the Royal College of GPs, the Royal College of Midwives. I went to every institution, scared the living daylights out of them, and they all introduced national guidelines and recognized the need for training and development. And we got to a stage we were now saving at least 6 or 7 lives in terms of homicides every year, and hundreds of people who were getting protection orders. But I wasn't finished. Today, you're hearing about Baby P again, because Tracy Connolly's been offered parole. That was another one of our cases. And I don't mention that I'm not going to mention the case itself and what happened in the case. I want to talk about what we do as a country, because we do 4 things every time there's a crisis. The first thing we do is we want a head to roll. Remember? The head of social services was told she had to resign by somebody called Ed Balls. I wonder what happened to him. And then the second thing that happens is we're not satisfied with the way we are risk assessing. We will throw out what we did before and come up with a new tick box assessment tool. Guess what? No tick box has saved anybody's life. The third thing that happened was hundreds of social workers left the profession. Hundreds left the profession because they said, well, all my training, all my judgment, all my experience is no longer necessary when you're applying this new tool. And the fourth thing that happened was more children were killed by their parents and carers in the year after than ever before. This is what we do. Blame, re-engineer, and guess what? And lose the talent and experience. And I thought we need to do something differently here. We can't do that anymore. We firstly have to admit when we get things wrong. And so when I moved to Manchester, when I met Erinma for the first time, I became aware of the Grooming Gang concept, which you were familiar with, and child sexual abuse generally. And there was a gang that were operating in North Manchester who had never been brought to justice, who were abusing children on an industrial basis. And I decided to prosecute them at a time when others were choosing not to. And also, I had to reverse decisions taken by others not to prosecute them, because they decided these girls, apparently, because of their chaotic and troubled backgrounds, wouldn't be believed. And I figured, actually, I believe them. It's our problem, not theirs. And the second thing that happened was my colleagues and police and others said, we can't prosecute this case, Nazir, because we didn't believe them. We dropped this case. How do we say to the jury, we now believe them? And I said, this is what we do. We say, we got it wrong. Not that she got it wrong. They got it wrong, we got it wrong. And you should have seen the faces in that room. We went to the jury and said, members of the jury, you're going to hear that we didn't deal with this case initially because we got it wrong. Again, the jury were going, oh my God, an institution admitting it got something wrong. And we got those men convicted. The next thing that happened was May 2012, which I will never forget, was suddenly the men were convicted, and then the world wanted to know what's happening in our country. Why are children being abused with impunity? Why are the estate and the authorities turning a blind eye and not listening to these people? And I said, it's because we're shit at our jobs. And no amount of guidelines and guidance is going to change that, or training for that matter, if we don't address this at its core. And somebody called David Cameron, I don't know if you remember him, he rang me up and said, Nazir, what's going on? I said, children are being abused in our country on an industrial basis. What are you going to do about it? Only last year, we learned that 3.1 million British citizens were sexually abused as children. 1 in 20 of us have been abused as children. That is the scale of what we're dealing with. So it wasn't just about the grooming gangs. It's about abuse everywhere that's happening in our society, where we've simply turned a blind eye to the worst. And that's my point, is that we've got to listen to those who've been impacted in order to respond. And we changed everything. Tomorrow night there's a documentary on BBC Channel 5, 2 hours, called National Treasure, National Disgrace. I filmed it a year and a half ago. I forgot what I said, so watch it tomorrow night. And it's about Stuart Hall, Jimmy Savile, all of those individuals that thought they were above the law, but they weren't. And we prosecuted them. And my boss at the time, Keir Starmer, what happened to him? Said to me, Nazir, get on with it, sort it out. And we brought in a panel, we changed everything, we changed the guidelines, we introduced new training. We brought a situation where we were the worst in our history, to the time I left the CPS, when we had the highest conviction rate for child sexual abuse in our history. That was about listening to the victims, about listening to survivors, about going to them and understanding their concerns and their journey and why they were being failed and responding accordingly. And that's what we needed to do. And do you know why? Somebody said to me, I'll finish now to enable questions. Two things. One, when I prosecuted Stuart Hall, he was convicted of the abuse of 12 women and girls and found not guilty of one. I went to see the one woman afterwards and I said to her, I'm really sorry I couldn't give you closure. And she looked me in the eye and said, Nazir, you gave me closure the moment you believed me. A judicial outcome was irrelevant. It was that somebody in authority, in a position that could do something about it, did something about it. And the second thing, about a couple of months ago, I've got a website, don't go on it. I haven't uploaded it for 3 years, I don't know what's on it. But it has a contact address, and people contact me daily. Victim survivors contact me daily. And there was a woman who contacted me 2 months ago, and she said, dear Mr. Afzal, you won't remember me. I was a victim of a non-recent sexual abuse case 10 years ago, where you convicted the perpetrator. I had lived with his abuse for 40 years. And never done anything about it, and you gave me justice. I now have terminal cancer. I have a few weeks to live. I wanted you to know the last 10 years of my life have been the happiest years of my life. That's why it's worth doing what we do. Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Can't see
you.
the questions.
I know, it seems like it was that far away, doesn't it? Thank you so much for that. I think what I've been hearing there is basically, because the first question on there, how can we make government listen to our concerns? How do we make them start listening?
Yeah.
And I suppose what they're asking is practically, how do we make them start listening? Because it's all very well saying, you know, they've got to listen more, but
I think you've got to paint them into a corner. And evidence is how you do that. Anecdote is not good enough. What you feel is not good enough. Evidence is what you do that. When Dominic Cummings decided to ride to Barnard Castle and the police said nothing would happen, I decided to investigate him. And I presented my report to the Metropolitan Police 6 months later, and they said, they gave this legal response, we're not going to do it. My point is that they had been painted into a corner. They now know that it wasn't a case of not being evidence. It was a policy decision not to prosecute. So they now are not on sound ground anymore. So that's the answer to that question. It's either data, but more often than not, it's evidence. And evidence comes from people's experiences. So don't go in there with, I think, or I believe. Go in there with, I know, you need to know. And if you don't do anything with it, then hold them to account over that. Don't let it slip. Don't let it slip. You know, I've contemplated a private prosecution, as I've done with the Prime Minister. I've contemplated that, but unfortunately the law doesn't allow that. The law says only the Crown Prosecution Service can prosecute under the COVID regulations, so I couldn't do anything about that. But I would go as far as the law allows me to. And also it's important to use the media, communities, and work with other agencies, the COVID families, for example. I lost my brother to COVID 2 years ago. It's important that we recognize that we're not alone in this and work together collegiately. And I think that's the answer. So it's about evidence, but it's about working with allies.
I mean, absolutely, I agree with that about evidence and backing them into a corner. I don't know if many of you may not know, I mean, I'm from Manchester. A lot of my work has been around, you know, as you know, anti-gun and gang crime. And it took us 6 years to bring gun crime to the top of the government's agenda. But it was about producing evidence, because otherwise they didn't want to listen. It was always labeled as black on black crime. Yeah. So we had to go out and find evidence that, you know, white kids were shooting white kids as well. You know, it wasn't only black kids, because they didn't believe us, you know. So you're right with that, you know, getting actually concrete evidence, research and evidence. I mean, that's what I've done a lot of, backing them up into a corner, you know.
Absolutely. If they don't do anything with that,
yeah,
that's their problem, and you've got them. You've got them, because they have no answer.
Yeah.
You know? And they can't say, go away, we're going to conduct some research. You've done it for them.
Yeah.
Make it as easy as possible for them to say no. And when they say no, you know that they actually mean yes, but they can't admit to it.
That's right, absolutely. That's what we found. Next question is there conflict, which I don't think there is, but is there conflict between listening to survivors and listening to perpetrators?
No, I mean, the point is, I think the point generally is that I don't believe that people can't be rehabilitated, with one or two exceptions. And they're their whole life terms. They're never going to come out of prison alive. But generally, people can be rehabilitated. What we don't do is rehabilitate them. Anybody who works in the prison service will tell you 23 and a half hours locked up a mentor and a coach, I'm afraid we have a revolving door. They go into prison, they come out of prison, they go into prison, they come out of prison. So we're not listening to perpetrators. We're not doing anything to prevent and keep us safe constantly. Listening is the skill. And at the end of the day, you will probably find out from a perpetrator why it is that they offend. That is what you need to find out.
Yeah.
Because then that's something you can address.
Yeah, and that's something you can work on. There's a question here to both of us. There's a movement in the US for communities to rely less on the police and address crime themselves by peaceful means. Do we need the same?
I'm trying to, which question is that?
It's now just gone up there in green.
There's a movement in the US for communities to rely less on the police and address crime. Well, two things. Well, one thing particularly, I'm not a strong supporter of vigilantism.
No.
I think it's unfair for starters because how do you know? You don't know. Do you remember back when there was a scare around paedophiles, and so pediatricians were getting their properties burnt? You know, people are relatively ignorant generally unless they're properly educated. So I don't believe in vigilantism. Similarly, I know there are vigilante paedophile hunters, for example, and I've said to them that you're causing more problems than it's worth because you might find a paedophile, you present that evidence, and because you haven't followed process and procedure, that offender will be found not guilty and they'll feel they can do what they want. That's the worst that you can do. So I don't believe in vigilantism, but I do believe in community responses. And I think that's what the question's really aimed at, is that nobody wants crime. I mean, one of the upsides stroke downsides of COVID is I've got a WhatsApp group in my neighborhood where every house is on it. And they tell if anybody's walking down the street, do you know this person walking down the street? You know, credit to them, great. I think we need to understand that not everybody walking down the street is going to be an offender. But we are looking out for each other more so than we ever are. And I think there's a sense of, that's how we will keep ourselves safe. But again, my point is, let's imagine that your community does keep yourself safe. The offender will just go to the next community. So unless we start addressing why these people offend, then we're just moving the problem along.
Absolutely, and I think also, in Manchester, my organisation, we organised Peace Week for 10 years. And basically that was about getting different communities from the so-called opposite sides to work together in different ways and work with other people in the, other stakeholders in different ways from what they normally would. And that was all about peace. And it was all about bringing peace to the streets. So there are peaceful ways that you can actually galvanize and bring people together, in the name of peace, and not, like you say, not vigilantism, but actually bringing people together. Because at the end of the day, up in Manchester, we all wanted the same thing, was peace on the streets. We all wanted to be safe. So
Absolutely.
We worked around that instead. So yes, that is possible to do. You mentioned paedophiles in your last question, and there was a question there, but it's just disappeared. Somebody, there was a question. Oh, anyway, I'll just take the next one. Okay, you mentioned that we need to, we've had that one. How did you measure the impact of the various strategies and guidelines on the various issues that you addressed?
Well, it varies from, again, we shouldn't have one size fits all. And you have multiple strategies. One of the things we do very badly is how we engage with communities. So police will have something called independent advisory groups, upon which the community leaders sit. Anybody got a community leader? I ain't got one. And I have wasted enough time sitting in a room with somebody who represents nobody and knows nothing. So what we need to do, it goes back to my earlier point, go to people. Go to wherever they may sit. Go to wherever they may meet. That's where you'll measure their impact. If they say to you, we don't feel much safer because of what you put in place, that's your measurement. Not the fact your data says, it's down 0.3% or something stupid. It's the person's experience, the person's perception that is your measure of impact.
But usually, because I've heard this a lot, government or other people will say that we are hard to reach.
That's have you heard that? I mean, it's so nonsensical. It's not that, it's lazy leadership. The fact that you somehow think, because, you're putting all year round, come to us, or we will, Erinma knows, I'm chairing a knife crime summit in Manchester on Friday, and Andy Burnham's asked me to chair this. And I said, Andy, you come along, you speak for 3 minutes. I've given him 180 seconds. And I've said to the Chief Constable, you've got 3 minutes, and we're going to spend 85 minutes listening to people around the table. And also, I said to them, I will choose how, Erinma's going to be there, I will choose who will be around the table. Not you, I will choose. And literally, there are people around that table who've never sat around a table before. You know, originally I was going to ask for it to be held in another part of Manchester, not central Manchester. And I listened. They said, Nazir, if you organise it in, say, Rochdale, then people will think it's just a Rochdale problem. And I understand that. So I had to learn a bit of learning. Yes, we'll do it in the centre, but I will pick the people that will be there. I will ensure that they are the people that are heard, not the authorities. It won't be an information sharing, a giving. It'll be an information sharing and learning exercise. So hard to reach does not work. You know, it's laziness on the part of people. There is no, you know, I remember doing something around traveller communities, 2012, and I went to the Gypsy and Traveller Network have an office in the particular site in Leeds, and I went to this site. Again, my people were saying, and I went there, and I sat in this room with. It wasn't even a room, probably a caravan, I don't know what it was. And they ripped into me for 90 minutes. At the end of 90 minutes, I learned tons. They realized I was listening, and we moved on from there. And you have to go to people who otherwise would feel disengaged, or who feel disempowered. You know, and also stop looking down on people. The only time you should look The only time you should look down on somebody is when you're helping them up.
Yeah.
You know? And time and time again, it's like, oh, they're not really educated. They haven't been to university, or they don't know English, or whatever it is. We make excuses. What they're saying, though, is more valuable than what you're saying.
No, absolutely. I agree with that as well. I remember when Tony Blair came to Manchester, to visit us. Well, first of all, they asked me to come down to London to be part of a gun summit and tell them all about gun crime, you know, in Manchester and in Moss Side. And I said to them, you know what, I am not coming to London to sit down with a room full of probably white middle-class men who probably don't even know where Moss Side is. It's better that they come to Moss Side and listen to some real stories and real people. So we gave them the challenge, and he actually did come, and I did the same as you. When they said, right, we're going to have this person, that I was like, no. I will choose the people that need to be there so that we hear some real stories. You know, we don't just want the yes people. We want the people that are going to give them, you know, and that's what we got. But it worked, you know, it worked. Like you said, there were people that they'd never met the Prime Minister, and they probably never would. But, you know, they were able to have that audience and have that true conversation, you know, with him. Oh, talk about Prime Minister. Someone's asking very quickly.
Would you run for Prime Minister, please? Not if you have to lie, cheat, break the law, and lack any integrity.
Okay, let's go to this one. The politics of race seems to play a part in how or whether violent crime is addressed, you know, or not. How do community have power against structural racism?
Well, the good news on that front is my next book is all about this subject. So in September, through HarperCollins, my book is called The Race to the Top. And it flows out from a conversation I had with somebody called Theresa May about 6 or 7 years ago. She said to me, Nazir, how can there be structural racism in this country when you're the Chief Prosecutor? And I said, have you got 10 minutes? And she goes, yes. And I'm glad, again, credit to her. She listened, she went away and said, oh, I need to do something about this. Absolutely. I've spoken, as part of my book, I've spoken to senior leaders across every bit of British public life who are from people of colour, and asked them what are they, and Erinma is one of them, what's their experiences. And to a T, they've suffered, and they suffer racism now. And the other thing, one theme that in the book, which is really troubling, and I hope we'll have a conversation about that when the book comes out, is fear. Even these people who are the most powerful people in our country are scared to death to talk about their experiences. There is an individual who is in the top 100 in the world in their profession who said, Nazir, I can't speak to you on the record because it'll be career ending. Now, that's what structural racism does to you.
Yeah.
It's embedded in every part of our society, not just in justice, in every part of our society. And it troubles me to the point where I've written about it, and I hope we can have a proper conversation when the book comes out.
Okay, sticking with race, why do you think we continually fail to build trust in communities that have a higher numbers of people of colour? What can we practically do to turn this
Because
around?
we do the same thing. Isn't that a definition of madness, isn't it? Where you do the same thing and get the same outcome. You know, we have the same approach, same strategy, even the same people. Our EDI people can go and do that engagement for us. Any EDI people in the room? Right? They can go and do that for us. And they have they don't have access to the board. They don't have the ability to make decisions. And somehow they've ticked a box. You know, the reality is that I personally read something, one company has decided their 300 most senior leaders will go and talk to people of color in the communities. Credit to them, I don't know, but I can't remember who they are. Because I don't believe a word they've said. I think that's probably what it is. Absolutely, I think your chiefs, your CEOs, your chief operating officers, your directors of HR, everything else, should stop relying upon your EDI officers and they should do the work themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, let's go to this one. Acceptance of bad behaviour is permeating government, even if found, gosh, it's when it changes, even if found guilty of wrongdoing, not resigning. How do we ensure it doesn't undermine trust in our legal system?
Of course it does. I mean, there's no getting away from it. I bet you a bottom dollar. I mean, I was talking about Will Smith. He's not in the room, by the way, is he? I was talking about Will Smith a couple of days. You know, what he did, no, is unforgivable. There are people now who think the way you respond to some hateful words is go and slap them around the face, right? So the same thing applies to, well, more so to people in government and people in power. If people in power think the law doesn't apply to them, you know, what did Dominic Raab say this morning? The Prime Minister told the truth to the best of his ability. I really don't get that. I really don't understand how it's the truth. It's either the truth or not the truth, and not, you know, the whole truth and not the truth. You know, we expect, there has to be a greater expectation of our leaders to be transparent, to be open, to be accountable, to recognize the rules apply to them as they do to everybody else. Because when they stop doing that, then you can rest assured that little Johnny or little Jane or whatever in the street will think it doesn't apply to me either. And I bet your bottom dollar, I have not been to a magistrate's court recently, but I suspect you're going to be hearing defendants saying, well, if the Prime Minister can do it, I can do it.
Yeah.
Or if the Prime Minister can say that, and I will say that. And they will still have the book thrown at them. But what is it doing to our culture and our society when we can't trust people anymore, particularly our people in power? You know, we've got to a situation where leadership, you know, I've worked with 10 Attorney Generals, and we have the worst one in our 10 right now. I've worked with 8 Prime Ministers, and we have the worst one. I look across Parliament. Somebody asked me if I want to be a parliamentarian. Fuck off. You know. You know. The last thing I want to be is amongst that group. Yeah. I mean, with few exceptions, the intellectual capacity of our parliamentarians is not up there, is it? Right? Is it up there right now? But we deserve better. We deserve better as a country. Our citizens deserve better. We are making enormous sacrifices. Look at the sacrifices we've all made over the last 2 years. We're making enormous sacrifices, and we'll continue to make them, the cost of living crisis, et cetera, et cetera. We need our leaders to appreciate that and recognize that, and they're not doing that by simply denying the reality. Okay,
which then takes me on to this question. How do we tackle, thank you, how do we tackle the inequalities in communities? During the pandemic, we saw some communities affected more than others.
Do you know, it starts with one. I did Desert Island Discs. I don't know if anybody listened to my Desert Island Discs. And one of my songs was talking about revolution by Tracy Chapman. And I said, revolution can be changing one person's life. It doesn't have to be what you think it is, that we change everything and everybody. I've given you examples already of people's lives who they feel their lives have changed for the better because of the work that I've done and work people around me have done. And I think that's the reality is that, you know, health inequality is, the whole pandemic has shone a light on health inequality, the way the justice system is operated, you name it. The saddest thing is I don't see the work happening to change, to respond to what we've seen. You know, we're shining a light on it, but I don't see the work. But I go back to my point about revolution being one person. Why wait for somebody else? There's 200 people in this room. Every one of you could do something here. And once you've done that, you've saved 200 lives and changed 2,000 lives or 20,000 lives. Don't wait for government, don't wait for authority, individual power and the power of one. Did you think that Rosa Parks asked for permission to sit on that bloody chair? Don't ask permission, get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to young people. How do you think that young people can improve the bad in society? How do they get involved? Because, you know, again, I think with our young people, we tend to talk about them, you know,
talk to them,
with them.
You know, I'm very fortunate. My legacy, as any parent probably will have the same, are my 4 kids, you know. The youngest is 21 next month, and the oldest is 26, and they are my pride and joy, and they've got a WhatsApp group, and I wish I had access to it, you know. I don't know what they're talking about. But, you know, if I want to know what's going on, I ask them. I'm very fortunate that I can do that. Most people haven't got the opportunity to do that. It's that earlier point about don't expect them to come to you. And again, somebody said to me the other day, when I wanted to engage with young people, I talked to my youth parliament representatives. Now, I credit to the youth parliament, it does great work, but I can assure you the representatives of the youth parliament are not representative of the students and learners in your school. I'm a chair of an FE college, Hopwood Hall, in North Manchester, and they are from the most deprived community in Manchester. Most of them haven't got GCSEs in maths and English when they come in, and we add enormous value, but that's never respected. The institutions that get good people and turn good people into good people, get all the money and all the representatives. I think organisations like Hopwood Hall, who work with the most challenging young people and turn them into brilliant citizens and work with them, those are the ones that need to be celebrated and valued. And I think that we've got to, again, I have all these fora that I engage with, where young people invariably, you know, they are challenging conversations. You know, I remember sitting on, it wasn't this stage, but not just round the corner from here, with 400 law students in the room, A-level students. And the man next to me was president of the Law Society, and he said to them, "Welcome to my yard." And 400 children just laughed at him. And he'd lost them. He'd lost them immediately. Don't pretend that you're them, listen to them.
Absolutely, yep. Okay. Going back to, you know, knife crime. When the initiatives regarding deterring knife crime and honour killings were being organised, was there any resistance from other officers? And how did you overcome that?
Yeah, it had to be a team effort because criminals actually find the gaps. So if one institution is doing a really good job, the best example is not those 2 issues, child sexual abuse. When I prosecuted the Roster gang, I said to the care homes where some of these girls were, I said, do the police know where you are? And they said, no, data protection, we don't tell the police where we are. And I said, you know who do know where the victims are? The predators, they're sitting outside. You know, this is nonsense, isn't it? That data protection is about protecting the person about whom the information is held, not your organization or the reputation of your organization. So the point is that there are so many excuses given for why we don't properly engage and why we don't properly do our jobs. And I'm not a strong believer in conspiracy theories. People love to say it's conspiracy, this. I think it's just hiding incompetence. You know, isn't it? It's easy to blame a conspiracy than to say that we're rubbish, isn't it? But I would prefer that we say we're rubbish. That's how we win trust. If we're not good at what we're doing, can you help us make us better at what we're doing? And I think that the reality is that we can only get better as a community. And what New Local do and what you do on a daily basis is absolutely astounding. You know, you leave me in awe with everything that you do. I want to help you, and thank you for helping your communities.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll wind up there now. I think the only one last
I see the
thing.
clock saying 8 seconds.
I know it's saying 8 seconds. So I was going to ask, how can we inspire our communities?
How can you
Inspire hope in our community?
Oh, hope. My last chapter of my book is called Hope. And do you know why it's called Hope? Because I'd spent 12 chapters painting misery. And I thought, you don't want just misery, you want hope. And do you know where the hope comes from? It comes from the people who've overcome doesn't matter how terrible these barriers have been, they've overcome them. And then the final 4 paragraphs of my book are my children. I said to them each, it's challenging, 200 words please on what you hope for the future. And they said, doesn't matter, I'm paraphrasing, it doesn't matter how tough it is, you had a tougher dad. And Granddad had it even tougher, you know? But I will rise above that. And so putting our faith in our children is what gives me hope.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.